As the system accommodates new air traffic controllers and new pilots, you're going to have new people in the system, and you've got the deregulation environment. You've got more airlines.
Safety is a very difficult thing to define. The lack of accidents does not in itself mean that something is safe. We have a potential that we're having to deal with here also. And I do believe that the margins are being reduced, that the operating philosophy of the airlines has changed based upon their increased competitive pressures.
Early in 1982, a disaster occurred which suggested that all these influences had converged to strain.
As the system accommodates new air traffic controllers and new pilots, you're going to have new people in the system, and you've got the deregulation environment. You've got more airlines.
Safety is a very difficult thing to define. The lack of accidents does not in itself mean that something is safe. We have a potential that we're having to deal with here also. And I do believe that the margins are being reduced, that the operating philosophy of the airlines has changed based upon their increased competitive pressures.
Early in 1982, a disaster occurred which suggested that all these influences had converged to strain the system to breaking point. Even more shocking to an industry normally preoccupied with nuts and bolts was the attention this accident focused on human beings.
Air Florida was indeed a crucible of human factors. It was a quintessential example of what happens in an airline crash, a crash of any sort, when there's nothing wrong with the airplane. It's all a chain of human failures that led to that accident.
January 13th, 1982. At 4:01 on that snowy afternoon, Air Florida Flight 90 was at the bottom of the Washington, D.C. Potomac River. The rescue drama was about to be played out in real time on live television. The Boeing 737 had collided with the 14th Street Bridge shortly after takeoff from National Airport on its way to Fort Lauderdale. 4 people lay dead on the bridge, and America watched in disbelief as helicopters hovered over the river searching for survivors. Only 5 people were pulled out of the water alive. Safety Board accident investigator Rudy Kapustin was on his way home when the news broke.
Just as we got ready to go in the elevator, somebody came out and said, airplane just hit the 14th Street Bridge. And it just didn't sink in for some reason to none of us that this was a big airplane. My response was what the hell's a little airplane doing flying on a day like this?
A major snowstorm had closed National Airport, and the Air Florida 737 was held at the gate for 2 hours, waiting for snowplows to clear the way to the ramp. At 3:58 p.m., the sound of laughter was heard in the cockpit as Flight 90 was being cleared for takeoff. Less than 3 minutes later, at 4:01, First Officer Roger Pettit tells Captain Larry Wheaton they are going down. 1 second later, the sound of impact ended the transmission.
We're going down, Larry.
7 days later, the cockpit voice recorder was dredged up from the river. Its grisly testimony helped explain the mystery of why the plane had been able to leave the runway, but without enough clearance to miss the bridge.
On the Air Florida cockpit voice recorder, we became aware that something just wasn't quite right with the engines.
Paul Turner is the Safety Board laboratory technician responsible for analyzing the cockpit voice recorder.
We all had this funny feeling about it not having enough power on it. So I brought the tape into the laboratory in the other room, and I ran a analysis on a spectrum analyzer on the tape and was looking at the engine sounds. And it became apparent that when he ran his stand-up check with the throttles, and he pushed the throttles forward, and he checked his engines out, and then we should have seen an increase in the engine power, and the engine should have gone up, and they didn't. They just barely rose, if at all, and then they were stabilized at that particular EPR setting, which is how you set this engine pressure ratio.
The next test confirmed the idea that the crew had tried to take off with only 3/4 of the necessary engine power. Boeing experts later confirmed Turner's hunch that this was due to an ice-blocked pressure duct. This, in turn, had created a misleadingly high indication of the engine pressure ratio. The first officer could see from the other gauges that something was wrong, but the captain paid no attention. Determining why the duct was blocked raised the question of whether the engine de-ice was on.
We went through the portion of the checklist in which the captain reads, or the captain replies to the co-pilot as to whether the de-icing system is on or off. He said, anti-ice, the answer would be on or off. And those two words are sometimes difficult to differentiate in the cockpit with all the other noises on. And the group was actually divided in this particular case. And
Clearly, the response was off. And because everybody that listened to it, including the people that had no reason to be partial towards the investigation, our own people couldn't believe it. And of course, the Air Florida people didn't want to believe it. Pilot group didn't want to believe it, that the response was off.
Failure to turn on the engine de-ice in the middle of a freezing snowstorm was only one of the cold weather protocols flouted by this crew. They also ignored other de-icing procedures and knowingly took off with snow and ice on their wings. Patricia Felch, one of only 5 survivors, later recalled her concern during testimony at the accident hearings.
I remember the last de-icing was about 3:15, and I remember we took off about between 5 of and 4 o'clock. I had turned to my boss and said, they're going to have to de-ice us again. And when they came back to the right side, I turned and said, see? And he just laughed. But they never came back to the left side of the plane.
7 months later, the National Transportation Safety Board report implicated the controllers for the long delay between de-icing and departure clearance and the plane's design for a winter performance defect. But chief blame for the accident was placed on the Air Florida crew for 3 different counts of faulty judgment before and during takeoff.
There were a lot of people at the time of the investigation and during the formulation of the report that did say, this is probably our first deregulation accident, but Air Florida had a pretty good screening process. But this particular pilot, as captain, was picked up from another airline, Air Sunshine, and he kind of fell through the crack. He didn't go through the screening process.
people have said that the crew was inexperienced, or that the crew didn't know what they were doing. And there's several ideas along this line. The fact that they flew out of Florida and were not used to icing. However, they flew into the north, and the co-pilot particularly was an old fighter pilot who had plenty of experience with icing, and so you would have to say in this particular case that they were almost led into this thing by the circumstances.
The first officer was described by his friends as jovial, witty, a good guy.
He was considered a fairly sharp pilot, though. Skills-wise, he was fairly sharp, and knowledge on the equipment.
Nobody wants to believe that pilots make mistakes, including pilots themselves, but they do. For all its complexity, Air Florida is not an unusual accident. Between 60 and 80% of all plane crashes are blamed on cockpit error. Certain U.S. airlines, like Continental, now make their crews attend classes designed to deal with this problem. In this seminar, instructor Frank Tullo reviews the Air Florida case, emphasizing the breakdown in communication between the first officer and his captain.
And what I want to make sure you understand is that any act of assertiveness here would have prevented the accident. And if the co-pilot had just stopped nurturing this captain and said, we got to do something. We have to either push the power up or abort. Because he obviously saw something. 5 separate times he made it a point.
Ordinary human failings, not paying attention, being afraid to speak up, disrupt the teamwork so crucial to safe flying. Aviation today is more than handling a machine. It's handling people, and the accident rate suggests that pilots are ill-equipped for this management role. A study of all plane accidents occurring between 1959 and 1982 shows crew error as the most frequent cause, followed by the aircraft, weather, airport management or air traffic control, miscellaneous, and in sixth place, maintenance. Increasingly, the planes themselves are not the chief cause for concern. 30 years ago, the likelihood the equipment would fail was 10 times higher than it is now. Since the first turbojets of the 50s, each new generation of aircraft has become more automated, more reliable, and safer to fly. But if the planes have improved, the same cannot be said of the pilots. Captain Mel Volz is safety consultant and former head of training at United Airlines.
The manufacturer has done such an outstanding job of providing us with just a remarkable product. The airplanes today are so far ahead of what they were only a few years ago. They're strong, they're reliable, the engines don't quit, they just run magnificently. If we've done so well in attacking the mechanical side of the equation, that of course has left the human side over here, and that's the side we have to attack now.
Dealing with the human side has meant taking a close look at how pilots acquired the attitudes and cockpit behavior that is getting them into trouble. Part of the answer lies in the way many of them underwent their original training.
Remember, once you look around, keep your speed up, and if you do get a bounce, cut him off, and drive in range. When you get in range, shoot, and when you shoot, shoot to kill. Okay, let's go again.
Korea was just one of the proving grounds for many of today's pilots. Airlines have traditionally recruited military airmen, those brave mavericks who excelled in the single-seater, high-performance fighter aircraft. By the time author Tom Wolfe had immortalized the combat flying ace in his book, The Right Stuff, these men had found their way onto most of the flight decks of America's passenger airlines. That macho self-sufficiency that doesn't admit to difficulties is now dangerously out of place in the team-oriented peacetime cockpit. At NASA's Aerospace Human Factors Division, psychologist Dr. Clay Fouché is studying this legacy and the problems it has caused.
In the old days, if you're familiar with Tom Wolfe's treatment, The Right Stuff, pilots tended to be very individualistic, the types of individuals who weren't used to relying on other people to get something done. And I think a lot of that was bred from the single-seat, high-performance fighter aircraft school.
Flying an airplane is something I've wanted to do since I was 6 years old. The real reason why I like flying, I'm not sure I can tell you. But I have to tell you that flying an airplane is the best job in the world.
I've been flying for 30 years, and I wouldn't consider doing anything else. It's a very dynamic business. It's filled with a great deal of challenge and a tremendous amount of reward.
Where else could you get this kind of satisfaction? I take this gigantic airplane and fly it through the sky, and it's my sky, and it's my airplane.
The responsibility of passengers is not overwhelming. The idea is that you take excellent care of yourself and the passengers will be just great.
Most pilots that I know are confident in their own ability to solve problems. They feel that they are ultimate professionals, that they know the job, they know the resources.
It's a feeling of exhilaration, it's a feeling of accomplishment, and it's a feeling of mastery.
We're not completely sure what today's right stuff is, although if I were to venture a guess, I would say that you would see a lot more emphasis on both instrumentality or concern with the task. That's clearly important, since technical skills will always be important in this job. But you might also see an emphasis on expressivity or the ability to relate well to other people.
If stick and rudder skills are no longer enough, how will pilots with their technical orientation acquire the necessary new abilities? In search of a solution, and after 2 bad accidents, United was the first of a handful of U.S. carriers to embrace an idea called Cockpit Resource Management, or CRM for short. At their Denver facility, captains, first officers, and flight engineers all undergo 3 days of annual recurrency training. In the United program, concern for personal relationships is valued as highly as technical competence. Using ideas borrowed directly from business management, crews are taught to recognize how their individual styles can create the communication blocks which cause accidents.
I think so, too. Like that? So we would move this guy. Rob, would you have any problem with that? If moving him up this way?
Cockpit resource management has 2 aims. One is to a degree modify behavior. It's not sensitivity training, and we would not get into that. And the other is to also get the crew to work together as a crew in all circumstances.
There are a number of techniques that are utilized in CRM training, but one of the most, I think, useful techniques is where pilots fly a full mission simulation, and that full mission simulation is videotaped, and they sit down with an instructor afterwards and go through exactly what occurred in the simulation. They see themselves very graphically.
These cockpit simulators so closely imitate the real thing that pilots can be exposed to hazards far too dangerous for an actual training flight.
8 pumps off, interconnect closed, system depressurized.
Instructor Tom Branch observes how well the team handles pre-programmed emergencies. This crew is about to lose electrical power, the kind of classic problem which could divert attention from flying the plane. In the debriefing to follow, the crew will be evaluated not only on how well they handled the technical challenges, but whether they did so in a coordinated effort.
Start number 3. Number 3. Start number 3. Okay, then.
Well, we've lost the cabin now. Close. Gotcha. Says the outflow valve was fully closed. Let's establish communication.
Video replay requires the individuals to confront themselves as team players. This exposure is sensitive, and the airline protects the pilots by erasing the tapes right after the post-mortem. We had expected privileged access, but a computer malfunction made the flight problems more serious than necessary, causing, amongst other things, a dangerous loss of air pressure. The crew had performed well, but by their standards, not well enough to share much of their analysis with us. Usually, privacy ensures a more revealing discussion.
You got it. Let's look and see what happened to us. You're at 35,000 feet, and you lost all your generators. And first of all, Frank, what was your problem? What was different back there than you expected to see?
Well,
one of the things you see in response to those situations are pilots turning around to the other crew members and saying, "My God, do I come across that way?" Whereas the other crew members will turn and say, "Yeah, you can be extremely overbearing in some cases." That type of feedback, video feedback, allows a person to see him or herself in a way that they're not used to doing.
This need to make the crews aware of the impact of their behavior is underscored by the cockpit voice recorders recovered from accidents. Conversations amongst the crew betray patterns which are being acted out over and over again. One of the most straightforward examples is the tragedy of Eastern Flight 401, so clearly uncomplicated by any environmental factors that it has become a classic case study. On a dark December night in 1972, 3 able-bodied and experienced pilots flew an L-1011 into the Florida Everglades after becoming distracted by a burnt-out light bulb. It sounds implausible, but crew preoccupation with minor mechanical hitches and an associated failure to monitor the instruments is a common cause of accidents. This disaster also illustrates some other recurring problems, like the failure of captains to act as leaders, make decisions, set priorities, and delegate responsibilities, shortcomings which are compounded by unassertive and complacent crew members.
That's right. It's got to be a faulty.
A simulator reenactment of the final 8 minutes of this flight shows how all these ordinary human failings led to a complete breakdown in teamwork and ultimately to the deaths of 99 people.
Force it, you'll break it, believe me.
5-inch hour during Eastern 401, just turned on final.
Eastern 401 heavy. Continue approach to 9 left.
Let's continue approach, Roger.
Actual airline pilots play the parts of the ill-fated crew. The dialogue is taken from the cockpit voice recorder and altered only to remove or change expletives and names. Certain omissions have been made to shorten the elapsed time.
Now I'm going to try it down one more time.
Eastern Flight 401 is on final approach to Miami International, runway 9 left. The nose landing gear indicator has failed to illuminate, so the crew cannot tell whether the gear is extended and locked.
You want me to test the lights or not? Yeah, check it. Watch seat back.
Doug, it could be the light. Could you jiggle the light?
It's got to come out a little and then snap in.
I'll put them on. Up to 2,000. You want me to fly, Doug?
What frequency did he want us on?
28.6.
I'll talk to him. All right, approach control Eastern 401. We're right over the airport here and climbing to 2,000 feet. In fact, we've just reached 2,000 feet, and we've got to get the green light on our nose gear.
Eastern 401, roger. Turn left heading 360, maintain 2,000. Vectors to 9 left final.
Left to 360.
I think it's above the red one.
Yeah, I can't get it from here.
I can't make it pull out either.
We got pressure?
Yes, sir, all systems.
Put the damn thing on autopilot.
All right.
See if you can put that light out. Well, you got to push the switch just a little bit further forward. Now turn it to the right a little bit. No, I don't think it's going to fit. Hey, get down there and see if that damn nose wheel's down.
Okay. You got a handkerchief or something so I can get a little better grip on this? Anything I can do it with? This damn thing just won't come out, Doug. If I had a pair of pliers, I could cushion it with that Kleenex.
The captain has neglected to divide up flying responsibilities. Everyone is absorbed by the crisis, so they don't hear the audio alert announcing a change in altitude.
To hell with this. Go down and see if that red line is lined up down there. Don't screw around with that 20-cent piece of light equipment. Eastern 401, I'll go out west just a little further if we can here and see if we can get this light to come on.
All right.
The autopilot has somehow become disengaged. The plane is slowly descending, and nobody is paying any attention to the altimeter.
It's always something. We could have made schedule.
Well, we can tell if the damn gear is down by looking down at the indices.
An emergency landing with a possible nose gear problem is neither very risky nor all that unusual. It's an option the captain could be preparing for now.
It's got to be a faulty light. Doug, this damn thing just won't come out.
All right, just leave it there.
Eastern 401, how are things coming along out there?
The controller's inquiry is too vague for the crew to realize he's asking about 401's surprisingly low altitude.
Okay.
180.
Hey, we did some of the altitude here.
What?
We're still at 2,000, right?
Hey, what's happening here?
Look at the time between when they first noticed that there was something wrong with the altitude and when they hit the ground. In that 8 seconds, those two pilots, both of them, were so removed from their primary job of flying the airplane that they couldn't do a thing. They didn't reach up and grab the yoke and change the pitch or the roll of that aircraft 1 degree. That's how removed they were from their primary job of flying the airplane. Bill?
Right, we're sort of ingrained in what we've been taught over the years. And it's like the old story about the job description. Hours of sheer boredom with moments of stark terror. Just what he was saying before. We're focused on one item at a time.
What you're saying is they're very task-oriented. We agree wholeheartedly. Pilots are task-oriented. They're used to having... As a matter of fact, sometimes you'll see a pilot, he's actually excited about the fact that he's got a problem. Good. Let's get in here and solve this problem. I would like to prove to the world that I could solve this problem.
Well, Frank, you know, it's very difficult for a pilot when he starts working a problem to leave that problem before it's resolved.
Well, how do we prevent that? How do we prevent that from happening in a cockpit, in your cockpit? How do you prevent that? Most of our pilots, prior to coming in, have a very low opinion of what we're going to do. They call it charm school. But as they leave the class, I usually get a healthy handshake and a thank you for a class they felt was very, very worth their while. We push sticky issues. We want the pilots to talk about the problems they've had in cockpits. It appears that just talking about them helps the situation.
Our thinking is still back too many years ago
where the captain was the god, he was Peter Pan and Mary Poppins all at the same time. And the first officers didn't have the input. Right. The first officers weren't allowed to have the input.
I'm flying with captains right now that unless they get to a very dangerous point, I'm not going to say a whole lot because they are really going to jump. I know of one right now that has been reported. There's been nothing done because he's a senior guy. He's a check airman. He flies good, but boy, you can't tell him anything.
I think if we learned anything over the past 2 days is the fact is us as first officers that we can speak up and question anything that we don't agree with.
It's my responsibility as a first officer to say something and have the guts that if I get called in, we'll take it from there.
While pilots themselves may find this training valuable, the impact of CRM as an accident deterrent is hard to prove. Most airlines have yet to climb on the bandwagon, and it's not clear that ingrained wrong stuff personalities are even amenable to change.
Well, changing human behavior is a very difficult endeavor, and clearly it's not something that you can bring about within a couple of days within the classroom. The program has to contain some recurrent training.
Now a member of the National Transportation Safety Board, psychologist Dr. John Lauber pioneered much of NASA's ongoing research into cockpit behavior. Does he believe that CRM training should be mandatory?
If it were an idea and a concept that was fully developed, that we knew what techniques worked and worked effectively, and we knew unequivocally how effective they all were, then it might be a good idea to consider making the concept mandatory. From my point of view, and I think others agree, it's still a concept that's in development.
The airlines themselves are divided in their enthusiasm for CRM. Pilots from 46 air carriers belong to the Airline Pilots Association here in a Washington, D.C. hotel for their annual safety forum. But only 2 members, Pan Am and United, and 2 other airlines, Continental and People Express, run full-fledged CRM programs. 5 others have partial training. Even among the majors, there are several who don't teach it at all. Captain Joe Oliver on the left is a 28-year veteran of Delta Airlines.
Our philosophy is directed toward a captain-oriented flight crew. In such a philosophy, he is the director, the leader of the band, and by the time that the individual reaches captain status, he is either able to manage the resources that are his, or the 4 days or 2 days of training that you give him aren't going to materially change that.
Charlie Finch is a Delta first officer.
The captain's always the final authority. You may be flying the aircraft, but he'll always be the one that maybe say, let's put a little bit more power on or carry it an extra 5 knots of airspeed. He reinforces your decisions in most instances. We have tremendous communication with Delta because everybody loves their job, and that's really important. But Delta doesn't have any training per se. Not that I know of. I mean, I've never been told how to get along with the captain. You just assume that you get along with this person and make his job easier.
Assertiveness training on Eastern Airlines as a standalone unit, as a specific objective, we've not felt the need for it. Most carriers have a corporate culture of their own, and each carrier is a little different one from the other. At Eastern Airlines, we have never had, to the best of my knowledge, any need to teach our pilots how to be assertive as such.
Captain Burton Beach is in charge of training close to 5,000 pilots at Eastern Airlines.
There is more evidence of the failure of the crew or the captain to effectively manage the crew than there is positive evidence, in my opinion, that it's a good thing. You can always point to accidents and incidents that have happened in the industry and say, well, if they had managed what they had a little better, that would not have happened.
Accidents are terrible research criteria for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you saw a reduction in accidents, it wouldn't mean very much because accidents are so infrequent. If you saw an increase in accidents, you could argue it the same way. So, in short, accidents really make lousy research criteria.
If we haven't had an accident for 5 years, can we presume because we didn't have one for 5 years after the program went in, it was as a result of the program? Would we have had another 5 years in the first place? Did we spend $5 million for nothing?
Airlines may be skeptical about cockpit resource management, but given the fact of human error, is there an alternative solution? At the Boeing Aircraft Company, engineers are trying to enhance safety through improved design. Perhaps automation can compensate for erratic behavior. Maybe the answer to pilot error lies in doing away with the pilot.
It's interesting to consider removing the pilot from the airplane. However, it's certainly not practical in the foreseeable future because the pilot's skill in cognitive decision-making just can't be duplicated.
Del Fadden is manager of flight deck integration at Boeing in Seattle, Washington.
The cognitive process that the pilot goes through is extremely complicated, much of which is not consistent from person to person, and so we don't understand totally how everyone would do the cognitive task. The physical tasks are much more straightforward. They're much easier to replicate with the machine.
The autopilot's the most obvious piece of automation in the airplane. It allows the pilot to be freed from the continuous flying task for major or minor portions of the flight.
And that has been improving over the last 20 or 25 years. The original autopilots were able to maintain the airplane in straight and level flight, but could do little else. Subsequent autoflight systems could make approaches, but couldn't land. Autopilots on 757 and 767 and some of the other contemporary airplanes can do very complex flight maneuvers in flight and do complete automatic landings. Ability there has been improved steadily with each airplane.
The precision of autopilot saves fuel and is useful in crowded air corridors. It frees up the crew to scan for avoiding other planes and cuts fatigue on long flights. But the autopilot does little to relieve the pilot's invisible workload. The 757 and its precursor, the 767, ushered in the first generation of Boeing planes to tackle this problem of mental workload. The heart of the innovation is a computer which augments decision-making, especially during times when pilots are liable to become overloaded and preoccupied. The engine, hydraulic, and electrical systems are now under computer surveillance. All the data is consolidated onto 2 screens. For the first time, the crew has the option of calling up what they want to see and when they want to see it. The information presented is very accessible and more easily read than scanning an array of instruments spread throughout the cockpit. Here, the computer is flagging an engine fire, identifying which engine and recommending a shutdown. Additional help can be had on demand. On the screen now are instructions for restarting the engine in mid-flight.
The information advance here allows us to put information together in ways that the pilot could do previously but had to do himself. He can concentrate on the decisions, what to do with the airplane, what to do with the relationships that he can see in the display, rather than how do these 2 pieces of information that are physically separated relate.
The system saves mental effort by assembling the information needed for a decision. But is this so-called glass cockpit a radical safety breakthrough, or just another resource which the crew must manage? Earl Weiner is professor of human engineering at the University of Miami. In collaboration with several airlines, including Eastern, he is observing the impact of the 757 on pilots who are making the transition from less automated planes.
Okay, we're going to St. Thomas, is that it?
Yeah, have you been down there before?
Yeah, I've been down once on this trip. St. Thomas, St. Kitts.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping we'd start flying that from New York instead of just Miami because it's a perfect airplane for that route.
One of the problems with any automatic device, and certainly the highly developed ones you find in the cockpit of a 757, is that they are what I call the 2 Ds, dumb and dutiful. Dumb in the sense that if you set up a condition which is incorrect, or possibly even hazardous, equipment won't necessarily recognize that. Dutiful in the sense that it will carry out whatever it's programmed to do.
In September 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down when it strayed into Soviet airspace. How it got there is still a matter of conjecture, but Earl Weiner puts it down to a typing error.
I think that either the wrong heading was programmed into the computer at Anchorage before takeoff, or the wrong initial position at Anchorage, or perhaps it was put into a heading mode in flight and just stayed on that heading rather than following the pre-programmed navigation points. I do not believe that it was a conspiracy on anybody's part at all. It was a simple navigational error. When you go from manual flight to automatic flight, a new set of problems and conditions arise. One of the problems is the need to monitor, which humans don't do very well.
Automation needs constant supervision, but pilots are alienated by this machine-minding role. They find it difficult to stay vigilant. The danger of this was dramatized by a 1985 Air China incident. Dynasty Flight 6 was at 41,000 feet over the Pacific when one of its 4 engines failed. The crew was not paying attention and didn't react in time. When the autopilot could no longer hold the nose straight, the plane started to yaw toward its dead engine. By the time the crew regained control, it had already fallen 6 miles. Passengers were injured and the plane damaged in an incident resulting directly from automation complacency.
The most difficult part is the monitoring job or the watch-keeping job. And when pilots speak of complacency, that's what they have in mind. The tendency sometimes to set up the equipment and program it and then not keep track of it, not watch where it's going. And that, I think, is a critical problem in the mind's eye of the pilot.
This is not the only source of concern for pilots who are trying to adjust to automation.
Some of the more negative things that one hears in interviews is a sense of powerlessness, a loss of control. They talk about being along for the ride. They refer to the new aircraft cockpits as Ataris and Pac-Mans. And some of the more specific complaints would be the problem of complacency, that they recognize that tendency to be complacent, a concern about loss of skills, and that's a very realistic concern. That is, if they are spending most of their time flying along under automatic control, now do they have the skills to take over manually and land the plane should the automation fail?
The heart of the problem of flying into an airport like St. Thomas, where the physical characteristics of the airport create a situation that is trying. You can't do much with automation. The wizards at the drawing board would like us all to believe that flying is an applied technology, but flying is still an art form, and automation is not going to do some of the things that have to be done.
Pilots are error-prone but irreplaceable, and even at their best, entirely at the mercy of a system over which they have no influence. This system is currently imposing some severe pressures from many different points of view.
Yeah, we've got some problems going on in the industry right now based on lack of management understanding of how close you can come to the line and not decrease safety. When you start putting pressure on pilots to fly with fewer and fewer amounts or lesser amounts of fuel, you start cutting the margin into an area that's subjective. In other words, you may be safe. You may never get close to crashing an airplane, but what you are doing is reducing the margin of safety.
I personally was involved in an incident which was frightening, and there have been several. It involved a takeoff situation where an airplane was cleared for a landing at the same time that the airplane I was in was on takeoff.
Well, the reports seem to indicate that we're seeing more runway transgressions. That's more than one aircraft or more than one vehicle on a runway when there should only be one there. We're seeing the automation issue, certainly because we're getting more automated aircraft.
There's a lot of other new airlines that are coming in that aren't as quick on the radios, that aren't as confident or experienced in the approaches that we've used over and over. And it's, you look out a little bit more than you used to.
Oh, there are very strong pressures about keeping integrity with the schedule and accepting airplanes that have mechanical deficiencies and flying in weather that you certainly don't want to fly in, but it's not illegal for you to fly in.
Delta, go around. Delta 557 is with you, final 17 left. American 539, I want you to go around, American 539 is on the go. 3,000, American 539. 9 maintain 3,000 above until on the localizer cleared in ILS runway 17 left approach. Going on out there. Y85 left to 190, clear ILS 17. What? Yes, sir. Nobody is to land at the airport, we've had a crash. Everybody go around. All right, hold 586.
cockpit resource management theory meets reality out on the line, where crews must operate under all kinds of pressure and make judgments based on insufficient and conflicting information. Nowhere was this made clearer than in a disaster at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport on August 2nd, 1985, when treacherous winds forced Delta Flight 191 onto the ground a mile short of the runway. Wind shear has caused 18 major U.S. accidents since 1970, and in most cases, the pilots were held responsible. This one killed 173 people and involved a very experienced crew flying for an established airline. It's the kind of accident that could well happen again. How can pilots avoid danger which is difficult to detect? And can they be held responsible for the outcome of an entire chain of human errors? Jerry Chandler is an aviation journalist who happened to be at the airport at the time of the crash. He has since published a book about the safety issues it raises.
On this road, Highway 114, we're heading west toward Fort Worth. Delta 191 first touched the ground off to the right, dug a trench about 270 feet long, hurdled this lane, airborne. Its left engine, the port engine, hit a Toyota driven by a mechanic from Mississippi coming out here for a job. That slewed the airplane about 10 degrees to the left, and that put it directly in line with the water towers. The tanks right over here to the left are the tanks which the airplane finally impacted. The nose hit the southernmost tank, pivoted the craft around, and actually snapped off the tail like a bullwhip. As it was, that tail was like an escape capsule for the 26 people who did survive.
We had a water tower. I think it was a wind shear. Did you see any lightning? No.
Delta 191 had flown into a type of wind shear called a microburst. A thunderstorm produces a funnel of rapidly downward moving air which slams into the ground, causing violent wind eddies and swirling horizontal tornadoes. The plane was approaching to land when the first officer saw lightning. A minute later, violent tailwinds and driving rain dropped airspeed and altitude, but 191 recovered. Another tailwind cut airspeed, a downdraft forced the nose down. It continued to descend into a tailwind which slammed the plane onto the road at 250 miles per hour. Dr. John McCarthy is investigating wind shear for the National Center for Atmospheric Research.
Wind shear alert, center field wind 300 at 9er south quadrant, wind 17010.
Well, from what we know of the wind shear events, particularly microbursts that we've studied, approximately 25% of the microbursts we know about are no big deal. Anybody can fly through them. There's probably 25% on the other end of the distribution, which is probably fatal. If you get into it, you're not likely to get out of it.
Is this what happened to the crew of Delta 191?
I'm acting chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board. We are here today to consider the aircraft accident report of the Delta.
The wind shear that caused this accident was the most violent ever recorded. Should they have been able to escape? And why did they fly into it in the first place? These were the issues on which the accident would be judged at the Safety Board hearing a year later. Did the crew know the severity of the weather they were flying into?
The controllers had informed them of the rain shower and the fact that the winds were variable at the field. That was the only additional information the controllers had provided the flight crew, which effectively was all that they were in possession of.
The forecast was only for variable winds and rain showers, so the airport was not expecting wind shear conditions or thunderstorms that afternoon. This lack of accurate information was linked with the operations of two different weather stations 72 miles apart.
The weather radar specialist at Stephenville makes and disseminates weather radar observations at least once an hour at about 30 minutes past the hour. On the evening of August 2nd, the specialist left his radar position at 17:35 for dinner.
The other weather service is at Fort Worth.
On the evening of the accident, the meteorologist took a supper break at 5:25 p.m. The meteorologist did not return from supper until about 6:10, which is approximately 4 minutes after the accident. The meteorologist testified that he would have issued a center weather advisory for the level 4 thunderstorm north of the airport if he had been at his position at 6 o'clock.
There were two weathermen monitoring the gestation of the storm.
in the busiest time of day at the world's third busiest airport. Both of them went to dinner at the same time, leaving, in effect, the radar scopes unmanned.
The air traffic controllers saw lightning at different times, but did not advise incoming planes.
The controllers had also stated during the interview that they had observed lightning on at least one occasion, and in the case of the local controller, he had observed one flash approximately 1.5 miles east of runway 17 left at about the time he observed the Delta aircraft emerge from the cloud mass and rain shower.
The controllers, the tower controller, he had an excellent view of that end of the runway. He saw that it was pretty severe weather moving in, and he didn't say anything. Now, none of these things alone would have caused the accident, and then you put them all together, and then you got an accident.
And as I mentioned earlier, we felt that the traffic load in the tower was such, particularly on the east side of the airport, that full attention was should have been focused on the traffic situation.
Runway, the taxiway to runway 17 right over here. The evening of the crash, the time the crash occurred, had 16 aircraft lined up waiting to take off on it. 17 right is the companion runway to 17 left. Both of these are being handled by one controller, supervisory controller handling the east. He had aircraft approaching, 16 aircraft waiting to take off. The FAA calls it moderate traffic. I don't see how you can call it moderate traffic.
Whether it falls into the category of additional services. Additional services are required duties of controllers, but are based on the time available to the controller to provide those services.
Had the controller found time to report lightning, it would probably not have changed the outcome because Delta 191 was already in the wind shear. The next line of questioning concerned the airport wind shear alert system and other potential sources of information about the bad weather.
In this case here, there were no alarms received in the tower until 10 to 12 minutes after the accident. Therefore, nothing was provided to the flight crew.
The low-level wind shear alert system in its current form at most airports has only 6 sensors, and the spacing between the sensors is like 3 kilometers or so. And unfortunately, many microbursts are like only 1 or 2 kilometers across, so that the problem is the net that we're trying to catch these things in is so coarse that they slip right through undetected. When Delta 191 encountered the microburst, it occurred outside of the network, and consequently the aircraft got into big trouble.
Once formed, the storm grew very rapidly, but from the Delta 191 approach side, it did not look as ominous as it did from the control tower. Not once before the accident did any arriving pilots complain about weather problems or request to discontinue an approach. Several of these crews had noticed lightning, but said nothing at the time. Delta 191 could see planes ahead landing safely, so there was no reason not to do the same. Or was there?
We played the tape through, obviously, with the group around the table here in the cockpit voice recorder lab. And it was obvious to us, that obvious to them, that they did see a thunderstorm, and they did comment on the fact that there was lightning coming out of it. And they chose to proceed into the thunderstorm.
The pilots were clearly flying into thunderstorm conditions. They were flying into a known rain shower with lightning dead ahead. We've been training pilots for years to stay out of thunderstorms at low altitude.
State in terms of the various...
Having determined how the plane flew into the storm, the board moved on to Delta policy on wind shear and thunderstorm avoidance. Whether the pilots had been given sufficient guidance and training in how to detect or how to fly through wind shears became quite controversial, and it took the board 5 report drafts to agree on whether the crew had enough information to have avoided this one.
And what is official company policy?
Yes. Once the pilot has been taught to recognize situations where wind shear might occur, company guidance, company policy is to avoid such areas.
In all conditions of flight?
Yes.
There were 2 basic positions being developed within the board. We could have split the vote, and it would have stood as the record on that. Had we done so, I'm afraid that would have been the story. That would have been the message to the public and to the airlines and to the FAA, a confusing one, a split message. And by taking all 3 factors and making them equal elements of the probable cause, it was an acceptable approach. under the circumstances, and that's why the boat turned out the way it did.
In effect, the blame was spread three ways: on the absence of wind shear hazard information at the airport, on the crew's bad judgment in flying into a storm and then continuing to land after the wind shear became apparent, and on the airline's ambiguous policy for managing situations like this.
We really don't know what more we could have done in the area of training. But what really concerns us, and where we have an enormous concern, is the fact that no warning was given to any of our pilots by the National Weather Service or by the FAA controllers about the presence of this storm, even though both could see it.
It was clear that we had to indicate to the public and to the airline community and to the FAA and others that we were very concerned about the action of flying into that cell.
I guess we're very disappointed in those findings because they point back to the crew as having the last chance at saving the airplane. They kind of like to point as the critical element in the end of the chain of events that happened.
There is a catch-22 involved here in that we are expected by our airlines and by our passengers to fly in all-weather operations. And we do so, and just statistics prove that we do so very skillfully. But occasionally, due to information you don't have, or bad luck, or mechanical difficulty, or something else, it can result in a tragedy. And then we are blamed for doing what we are in effect and actually required to do on a daily basis.
Whether any pilot alive could have flown through a wind shear of that intensity will never be known. But in an enterprise as complicated as our air transportation system, some accidents will inevitably occur. Pilot error is once again the weakest link in a long chain of human errors. Perhaps that flight could have been saved with better weather information, or if someone somewhere on the ground had made a better decision than they did. But ultimately, it is the crew that flies the plane and must bear the responsibility for decisions which no one else is in a position to make. Improved communications, better management of tasks, teamwork, cockpit resource management by whatever name, all these may not rescue any given flight, but couldn't they improve the odds on every flight?
Starting engines, circuit breakers and switches. Checked and on. Voice recorder. On. Tested. Oxygen. On 100 speakers, check and set. On 100 speakers, check and set. On 100% speakers, check and set. Indicating lights. Check left. Check right. Check here.
Tomorrow at this time, high drama, as we recount the story of the takeover of our embassy in Iran and how Canadian officials rescued a good number of American hostages. Escape from Iran, the inside story, tomorrow at 8, here on Channel 2. Stay with us now, another escape story coming up. The story of the people who helped American slaves gain their freedom in the mid-1800s via the Underground Railroad. Watch The American Experience, next at 9.
Pressure is 1300. Flight instruments. Set and cross check left. Set and cross check on the right. Mach airspeed warning. Tested. Static sources. Normal left. Normal right. Gear lever. Down 3 green. Radar. Tested and standby.